Economic growth. You would think that we would all be on board to the idea that the production of more goods and services is advantageous to people in general, but you would be surprised. There's quite a number of individuals who are of a contrary opinion concerning growth, probably due to the materials needed to produce that growth. Really, when it comes down to energy, I know that many of you perhaps have grown up and taken classes where they discuss this idea called climate change. And in actuality, amongst economists, there's a robust disagreement and perspectives regarding production, the science of climate, which is probably actually not what you've been looking at, but rather when it comes to actual scientists who are absolved of all political, perhaps, positions and funding. And there's actually, once again, some good disagreement between climate change and this concept of production. We're going to look at it from a macroeconomic point of view. And as always, I encourage you guys, there are different schools of economic thought. What we are studying is heavily Keynesian in general. So, once again, always keep an open mind to what you hear. Feel free to always disagree with what you hear, or more importantly, just think critical. What does it mean? John Maynard Keynes argued that growth came from three categories of factors. And notice that the supply factors, increases in the quantity and quality of natural resources, increases in the quantity and quality of human resources, increase in the stock of capital goods, improvements in technology, those will sound very familiar to you, as those were the assumptions that were fixed as we developed that model known as production possibilities curve. But in actuality, it was more than just the ability to produce more, because he argued that you needed to actually have the consumption of that increased production. And aggregate demand itself needed to be increased, and it could be done through what he referred to as monetary and fiscal policy, of which we studied in depth. Monetary policy is the Fed, and fiscal policy would be the government and what they do and the tools that they have. But even with those two in play, there's no guarantee that without efficiency factor that we'd be able to once again be productive at the utmost efficiency, which in our case is modeled by being on the production possibilities curve as opposed to being beneath it. Of course, unemployment is always apparent at all levels, but the idea is that the economy is producing at its utmost capacity. Now, what does that look like theoretically? I would say that let's look at this PPC. So the production possibilities curve, once again, was fixed on the fact that there are two goods in the economy, that there's fixed technology, that there's full employment. Now you have a much clearer idea what full employment is, and a fixed amount of resources. So if, for example, any of the supply factors, specifically the resources or technology, were to change, the entire PPC curve, in this case PP1 or WX, would move outward. And at all particular levels, we'd have more quantities of capital and consumer goods, a true model of economic growth. So in this case, we'll use the labeling of PP1 and PP2. That is economic growth on the PPC model. But where before we could have been at A or B or C, neither of them are particularly relevant, that we need more spending to ensure that we do move from any of those particular points, A, B, and C, to make sure that we're actually back on the new curve, in this case, point E. But the efficiency factor reminds us that we need least cost production. So once again, productive efficiency, where those resources of production are used to their utmost potential to make sure we do end up at point E and not point F, which, as you can see, would be beneath the production possibilities of in a particular economy. Therefore, that particular point F is describing inefficiencies that do exist. So, how does it go about happening? Well, we have this notion of labor and productivity and how society itself can increase its real input output and income, and one is by, of course, increasing the inputs. So when you and I simply talk about this concept of immigration, in which case a labor force is moving across a nation's border, that would be an example of how to increase the inputs, in this case, of labor. At the same time, we can raise the productivity of labor. So as you can see in this wonderful example, it's not so much the issue of, which I'm sure you have an opinion, of what is called child labor, but rather whether perhaps there is labor that could be more productive than children. So, labor productivity. Oh, technology is a wonderful thing. Capital stock growing is a wonderful thing. The ability of all those inputs, how they are managed, combined, and allocated by the entrepreneur, all of those will create more productive labor and therefore economic growth. So, when we think about this concept of technological advance in capital formation, accumulation, that is what is known as the capital stock. Education and training, actual education training that develops actual skills that are needed within the labor force. This concept of economies of scale, which is, as I show you on with my cursor, where an absolute larger and larger output is going to help drive down the cost of production. And productivity and growth is this idea that though we can never eliminate scarcity, we can minimize this idea of the burden of scarcity, where more and more individuals can enjoy the fruits of production as opposed to perhaps one, which is the concept, of course, the game Monopoly. So, what do we know? Historically, and you do not need to know any historical data for the purpose of the AP exam, but it does go without saying that technology and innovation has really led to productivity increasing within my lifetime and your lifetime. And it comes down to that all important microchip, this concept of simultaneous consumption, network effects. Network effects are an example. I think your text actually uses Instagram, where Instagram, if it's just you, is not particularly good. But the more and more people that begin using such a thing, the more and more valuable it actually becomes. That's what's known as a network effect. Global competition has just opened up more and more entrepreneurs who are just going to drive up more and more concept of productivity. And this, of course, is a key component of our particular class, and that is the idea of how you and I, using the extended aggregate demand, aggregate supply, have modeled economic growth both on a PPC, but also as a vertical long run aggregate supply curve. So we did this beautifully in class. As this moves out, AB moves to CD, simply means the economy has grown. That means that the amount of output at full employment has grown, which be a shift of the actual aggregate supply long run curve. We could show that using both the short run curves at the same time. So let's take a look at this. And this could be a quick blip from US history, where the long run aggregate supply curve has moved to the right. That does imply that full employment is no longer at Q sub 1, it is at Q sub 2. And we're going to talk about these price levels really quickly. So let's say that initially equilibrium right there, where the intersection of aggregate supply, short run aggregate demand, is right here, respectively at a price of P sub 1 and, let me see if I can do that better for you guys, Q sub 1. The aggregate supply we always draw as upward sloping because in the short run, and that is a short run curve, higher prices would cause firms to absolutely increase their output. That makes sense. I can sell my output at a much higher price. Assuming the changes in the supply factors, we talked about those earlier on a slide, cause the aggregate supply long run curve to shift to the right. Now, if there were no changes in aggregate demand, if I could just kind of extend out AD sub 1, look at me extend it out. As you can see, that intersects the long run aggregate supply curve way down here. So clearly prices would lower if there was long run aggregate supply growth, which I know you and I are thinking that's deflationary and that sounds wonderful. But the Fed, monetary policy, has expanded the nation's money supply over the years, such that that increase in the money supply has caused an actual increase in aggregate demand that has more than matched the particular increase in aggregate supply. So what has happened is that AD sub 1 has simply shifted to AD sub 2. And as you can see, we do not have this phenomena, but we're back in long run equilibrium, which we always talk about wage adjustment, right here. And that has probably been the story of your life, which is yes, real output in the long run aggregate supply has increased from Q sub 1 to Q sub 2, but the price level has not actually gone down, it has gone up. Long run aggregate supply growth with mild inflation. That is probably what you now understand as the Fed has a targeted rate of inflation. Last thing I wanted to leave you guys with is just the idea that 2016, 2020. This is from the Heritage Foundation, is what's called the Index of Economic Freedom. I would encourage you guys to take a look at it. And as you can see, the United States has been dropping. It has been recently within perhaps when you were in junior high or elementary school, the United States has dropped out of the top 10 of which the Heritage Foundation ranks their economic freedom. Now, whether that is good or that is bad, at all times, of course, that is a debate between you and I. So I hope you guys have a great day, and that is all I need you to look at when it comes to chapter 22. That should be sufficient for you. Feel free to read the textbook. It is always much more detailed, and the details are fun to think about. And you need to complete your chapter 22 practice multiple choice. Have a great day.